Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Can you target one part of a muscle more than another? Are certain exercises more effective for developing all of a muscle than other exercises? Today, we're talking about regional hypertrophy. So, what is regional hypertrophy? Most muscles have regions or sections or different fiber orientations or kind of heads of the muscle. For example, if you've ever seen someone with a really well-developed tricep, you might see that it kind of splits. And this is because there are different regions of that same muscle, that tricep. So you have the long head, the lateral head, and the medial head. Or another example is the glute max. Maybe less visible, but the glute max has three sections: the upper section or the iliac section, the middle section or the kind of sacral section, and then the lower section or the coccygeal fibers. So many muscles have these different regions or sections or fiber orientation. And science shows that we may actually be able to grow certain regions of the muscle with certain exercises. And this is called regional hypertrophy. However, we don't have sound research on every single muscle group, so it could be possible that some muscle groups respond to regional hypertrophy while others don't. So today, we'll break down most of the major muscle groups and discuss current literature around regional hypertrophy. I'll also mention where there are research gaps and where my assumptions come in. We'll start by discussing the lower body, then we'll get into the trunk, and then we'll end with the upper body. So let's start with the lower body, starting with the hamstrings. The hamstrings consist of the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. So three main sections of this one muscle group. Most of the hamstrings cross at both the hip and at the knee, so they extend the hip and bend the knee. Popular exercises for the hamstrings include straight leg deadlifts, hamstring bias bridges, hamstring curls, either on a machine or if you're in Evlo, we use the weight between your feet. Squats have been sometimes popularized to be a hamstring exercise. And we see from the literature that squats do not build the hamstrings. And this is likely because squats are also extending the knee and engaging the quad, which may kind of compete with the load to the hamstrings. This is called reciprocal inhibition. So essentially, to work the hamstrings, you either extend the hip or bend the knee. So what is better for the hamstrings then? Hip extension exercises like hamstring bridges, straight leg deadlifts, or maybe even like a hip thrust? Or is it knee curls? So hamstring curls, again, if you're in Evlo, curling the weight between your feet. I found some conflicting evidence. One study examined the difference between lying leg curls. So you're lying on your stomach, you're using a machine to curl your heels towards your glutes. And they compared that exercise to straight leg deadlifts and found that the lying leg curls activated the hamstrings more completely. But the issue with EMG and activation is that it isn't always a reliable predictor of hypertrophy or muscle growth. Just because you feel an exercise doesn't necessarily make it more effective. So I dug a little deeper. Another study showed that straight leg deadlifts and hamstring curls activated the hamstrings similarly, while the squat did not activate the hamstrings. Again, kind of matching with what I mentioned earlier about squats probably not being a very good exercise for the hamstring. Yet another study showed that hip extension exercises like straight leg deadlifts, or again, even a hamstring bias bridge, or maybe even a hip thrust, may be better for building part of the hamstrings, the biceps femoris long head, while knee flexion exercises like a leg curl may be better for building muscles like the semitendinosus and the semimembranosus. Another interesting study, this is the last study I'll talk about in regards to hamstrings, showed that including seated hamstring curls provided more growth to the hamstring than lying leg curls. So a seated hamstring curl, the main difference is that your hip is bent, your hip is flexed, whereas in a lying leg curl, your hip is straighter, your hip is in more extension. So what this indicates is that hamstrings may grow better when they're trained at longer lengths. Because the hip is flexed in a seated hamstring curl, the hamstring is lengthened at the hip. So this is one reason why we prop our knees on a stool and hamstring curl from there with a little bit of hip flexion, is because it's shown to potentially be better for hamstring growth to have some slight hip flexion so that the hamstring is trained at longer lengths. So here's my takeaway from all of these studies. A wide variety of exercises. So both knee flexion exercises, like the hamstring curls we do in Evlo, and hip extension exercises like weighted hamstring bridge, or even a hip thrust or a straight leg deadlift, are probably best for complete hamstring development. You don't have to do all of those, but choosing maybe a knee flexion exercise as well as a hip extension exercise at least. Okay, next is quads. So the quads consist of 4 main muscle groups, and knee extension exercises, opposite of the hamstring, so knee extension or straightening the knee, like reverse Nordic curls, knee extensions on a machine, sissy squats, all tend to work the quads most completely. This is probably because all 4 quads cross at the knee and only one of your quad muscles crosses at the hip. So operating at the knee tends to work the quads most completely. However, exercises like lunges and squats and ball wall sits where you are bending at the hip seem to favor a muscle of your quads called your vastus lateralis, while knee extension exercises, again, like a seated knee extension machine or a reverse Nordic curl, which we call matrix because it's a lot easier to say at our classes, or sissy squats, those tend to be better for the rectus femoris, the muscle group on top. This may be because the rectus femoris is the only quad muscle that crosses at the hip. So because exercises like a lunge or a squat are not only extending the knee, straightening the knee, they're also extending the hip. You have some reciprocal inhibition, or the glutes are kind of competing with the activation of the rectus femoris. So the glutes and the rectus femoris are competing against one another. So there isn't very good rectus femoris engagement. So a squat, a lunge, might be activating muscles like your vastus lateralis, your vastus medialis, but might not be so good for the rectus femoris. So including some exercises that are more knee-based, like again, a matrix, a sissy squat, a seated knee extension might be better for activating and growing the rectus femoris. Next, we have the glutes. The glutes consist of the glute max, the glute med, and the glute min. The glute max and the glute med are the only visible muscles, as the glute min is below these muscles. The glute max is the largest one. We'll start by talking about the glute max. As mentioned earlier, the glute max can be divided into kind of upper, middle, and lower portion. For most people, these upper, middle, lower portion is not going to be super visible, but you can technically divide it into 3 portions. So can you target each of those portions of the glute max? Some studies show that certain exercises may activate either the upper or lower portion of the glute more. But again, EMG and muscle activation is not always a reliable indicator of hypertrophy, but it could be a reason to mix up your glute training and choose different variations for the glutes. So a recent study showed that the best exercises to target the upper glute max are exercises like hip abduction with hip extension. So things like, a donkey lift with a weight behind your knee, or a cable kickback, or clams, or band walks, or side-lying hip abduction with a little bit of hip extension. Those exercises tend to be better for the upper glute max, whereas the lower glute max is activated more with hip extension exercises like, RDLs, bridges, hip thrusts, half deadlifts. I would also probably put in there lunges, step ups, Bulgarians, squats, glider lunges, anything like that. So having both more extension and abduction exercises into your routine, so clamshells, abductions, donkey lifts, hip thrusts, things like that, as well as more hinging movements like, your lunge variations is probably best practice. However, there is some conflicting evidence about if this activation of the upper versus lower actually translates into real different growth. So one study showed that both hip hinging movements, so squats, or you would put step-ups, Bulgarians, lunge variations, can provide the same amount of muscle growth to the glute max as a hip thrust. So interestingly, people think that hip thrusts are superior because they feel the glute activating more. But this study showed that just because you feel something more does not make it superior for muscle growth. The study found that growth was uniform between the upper, middle, and lower glutes with both squats and with hip thrusts. So the takeaway is, can you really separate and preferentially load the upper versus the lower glute max? Maybe not. But I think the takeaway is choose a variety of exercises, and you're probably going to see complete development of the glutes by just choosing a variety. I personally love to do a combination of lunge variations, so Bulgarians, step ups, glider lunges, as well as hip extension movements, half deadlifts, hip thrusts, bridges, donkey lifts, and then add in some abduction movements like side leg hip abduction and clamshells. I personally do not do squats or deadlifts, and we don't teach them in Evlo because they never felt good on my back. And I tend to get limited by systemic fatigue and back pain before my glutes and legs stop me. And I've anecdotally found from many of our members, many people that I've talked to, as well as all my past patients, not all my past patients, but many of my past patients, that they feel the same. They struggle with heavy deadlifts and heavy squats, and they feel like their back is what is limiting them rather than their legs. So this is why we don't do squats and deadlifts in Evlo, not because they're ineffective, but because there are other alternatives that will build strength and muscle in the glutes and potentially be more spine friendly. Another important thing to note is that a lot of people think that you're losing out on functional strength by not squatting or deadlifting, and this is not necessarily true. There is functional transference with these other exercises. So the same study that I referenced earlier showed in the squat and then in the hip thrust that both of those exercises had functional improvements in the deadlift. So neither of them were doing the deadlift, but they saw better strength in the deadlift. So developing your muscles, developing your glutes will have functional transference into your daily life. You don't necessarily have to do the exact movements that you would do in your daily life, like a squatting movement, in order to get better at it, to get more stable at it, and to stay strong in that movement pattern. What about the glute med? So the glute med is the one that kind of lies above or superior to the glute max. Interestingly, that same study showed that the glute med did not really grow with squats or hip thrusts. And this is probably partly because they studied both feet on the ground, right? So when both feet are on the ground, you have less pelvic instability demands. And so one of the primary functions of the glute med is to stabilize the pelvis. So because both feet are on the ground, it might not be getting a lot of load. So while those exercises are really good at growing the glute max, you may need different exercises for the glute med. Any exercise in which requires pelvic stability, so any single leg exercise like a step up, single leg hip thrusts, any lunge variation will activate and strengthen the glute med. However, like I said earlier, and like I've said multiple times at this point, activation does not always lead to hypertrophy. The most important aspect for hypertrophy is mechanical load and approaching muscular failure. So when we think about the action of the glute med and how to target that action and take that close to muscular failure, you would need more hip abduction movements, so leg moving away from your midline, like a side lying hip abduction or a weighted clamshell or a cable abduction or a hip abduction machine. The glute med is a muscle in which some would argue you don't really need to target in hypertrophy and grow because its main job is stabilization of the pelvis. And we were actually as a team having this discussion yesterday. Like, is it really important to tease out this muscle specifically just for hypertrophy or just for muscle growth, or is activating it and strengthening it with single leg exercises enough to kind of keep the pelvis and the low back and things like that healthy? So I think that's a discussion that's out for debate and probably not something that I have the answer for today, but I do like the idea of strengthening it directly, at least occasionally, by adding in some loaded hip abduction movements. We're doing this for you in Evlo, so you don't have to worry about programming that in, but that's kind of our rationale behind it all. And lastly, we have inner thighs. So inner thighs are, again, one of those muscle groups that's questionable about whether you need to directly isolate them. We do not directly isolate them because they're getting lots of work and they can hypertrophy and grow with exercises like lunging and hinging. But it doesn't hurt to directly activate them or directly train them with something like an adductor machine or a cable adduction. Doesn't hurt, but we just have come to the conclusion that we have limited time in our classes and we all have limited time in our week. So we're going to choose kind of the highest bang for our buck. They're already getting work with other exercises, so we don't really need to directly isolate them to grow them. So here's the takeaway for the legs before we move on to the upper body. Just doing squats and deadlifts probably is not going to cut it for complete development of the lower body. You're probably missing development of a few key muscle groups, namely portions of the hamstrings and of the quads. Squats don't seem to grow the hamstrings, and they also seem to only partially grow the quads, and they neglect the rectus femoris. Straight leg deadlifts do grow the hamstrings well, but they may be missing some growth potentially for the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. Additionally, you don't have to do squats and deadlifts to build the legs. There is a large variety of exercises that will work, and you can develop complete strength and muscle in all of the muscle groups of your legs without doing squats and deadlifts. Doing a combination of hip extension movements, so hip thrusts, weighted donkey lifts, step-ups, deadlifts or half deadlifts, bridges, glider lunges, squats, etc. And then also doing knee extension movements like reverse Nordic curls, or we call them matrix in Evlo, sissy squats, machine knee extensions, and some knee flexion exercises like hamstring curls, Nordic curls is important to add into your weekly routine. If you're an Evlo member, we are doing all of these movements every week, so you don't need to worry about programming them in. You are getting complete development of all of your leg muscles. So let's go to the trunk next. I'm obviously not going to go over all of the trunk muscles, as that would take forever. There's a lot of them, but we will discuss the rectus abdominis, so the six-pack muscle, and the obliques. And there are many more, but I'm just going to keep it at that today. So there's really little evidence about regional hypertrophy for the abdominals. Let's talk about the rectus femoris first, or the six-pack muscle, and talk about kind of what we do know. So there's debate about whether you can target your lower abs versus your upper abs. There isn't any research that I could find that says certain exercises grow the lower abs and others grow the upper abs. Many will say that, any loaded flexion exercise, so again, an Evlo like a ball crunch, will hypertrophy the entire rectus abdominis, both the upper portion and the lower portion. But I think more literature needs to come out to say conclusively. So bottom line with the rectus abdominis, we don't really know. Odds are just doing loaded flexion is probably enough to grow the entire rectus abdominis. Next, we have the obliques. Theoretically, the obliques can grow with flexion exercises, so like a ball crunch, as they assist with trunk flexion. But one study showed that rotational exercises specifically increase the thickness of the obliques, specifically the external oblique. So doing some rotation may be beneficial. In Evlo, we do this by kind of doing like a rotated ball crunch. Bottom line is you could probably benefit from doing some rotation and flexion exercises to target all of the trunk muscles. Whether you can grow the lower abs is up for debate. Again, even if you feel them engaging with certain exercises, doesn't necessarily mean they're benefiting more than they would if you're just doing any other flexion exercises. So my guess would be that maybe you can kind of target the lower abdominals, but I wouldn't really go out of your way. And just because you're feeling it burn more in your lower abdominals doesn't necessarily mean that it's benefiting that section of the muscle more. Okay, finally, we have upper body. So we'll start with the chest. I couldn't find much, surprisingly, but one study did show that pecs grew uniformly, both with flat bench press and with incline bench press. Shoulders are next. We're going to fly through this section. The shoulders are next, or the deltoids. The deltoids have very distinct divisions. They're one of those muscle groups that is probably the most distinct, and you can visually really see the distinctions. So you have the anterior, lateral, and posterior heads. The anterior head responds best to lifting your arms out in front of you. So narrow presses, front raises. The lateral deltoid, the one on the outside, responds best to moving the arm away from your body. So lateral raises. And the posterior deltoid responds best to horizontal abduction, so flies or row variations. Next, we have the triceps. They have three main divisions: the lateral head, medial head, and long head. One study showed that the triceps have more complete development when the shoulder is flexed, so skull crushers or overhead tricep extensions, than when the shoulder is neutral, so like in a kickback or a tricep pull down. This could be because the tricep long head crosses at both the shoulder and the elbow. So like the hamstrings, potentially training it at longer lengths influences its growth. Next, we have the biceps. Biceps are an interesting one. Preacher curls allegedly grow the lower bicep more than a regular curl. I personally don't love preacher curls. I think they can be a lot of stress on the elbow. There's a lot of load to the elbow in a fully extended position. which, as we see from the literature, can grow the biceps for sure. But I don't necessarily think that you need to add it. And I don't know if the risk is worth the reward unless they're an exercise that you really enjoy and you think feels really good, because I think you can do regular bicep curls and still see really great growth. And lastly, the traps or the upper back. So most studies focus on EMG or activation, which, as I've talked about before, we know is unreliable. So we have to go more on muscle action and thinking about opposite position loading of these muscles and thinking about the fiber direction, how they pull on the bone, and loading that from that direction. So the traps are divided into upper, middle, and lower portions, and they all retract the scapula. They bring your shoulder blade towards your spine. So all of the traps will be activated with any rowing variation. Both the upper, middle, and lower will all be activated and worked in a rowing variation. We like kickstand rows the best because you can get more scapular range of motion that way. But to grow the upper traps more, you would want to do shoulder elevation, like shoulder shrugs. So lifting your shoulders towards your ears with weights in your hands. The lower traps depress and retract the scapula. So anything that moves the shoulder blade down and back towards the spine, again, like a row or a lat pull down, would be a good exercise for this muscle. And again, the middle trap gets really great work with any rowing variation. So those are the muscles that I'll break down today. And here are the takeaways when I researched for this episode. 2 things. Number 1, do not overthink this. I know you type A people who want to do everything perfectly may find this episode a little stressful and may come to us with a million questions, but I do not want you to overthink this. Try to do a variety of exercises. I think that should be the takeaway. Try to do a variety of exercises. We're doing that in Evlo, but don't stress if certain movement patterns don't work for you. What I found in my own body is sometimes I'll gravitate towards one exercise over another. And I'll do that exercise for a long period of time, start to feel really good, really strong, really stable. And then I'll go back to the exercise that maybe didn't feel so good and it'll start to feel good again. So I don't think we need to shove our bodies into exercises that aren't feeling good just for the sake of potential regional hypertrophy. Because when I looked at regional hypertrophy and compared 2 different exercises, usually both exercises studied were effective for strength and muscle growth, with one maybe having a slight edge. So sometimes the edge was very minimal, if at all. So it's just not worth shoving your body into a variation that doesn't feel good just because you think it's slightly better, because you can still see results from doing the other one. So choose the ones that feel good. And then my second takeaway was that feeling something doesn't make it superior. This was kind of a common thread throughout the whole podcast. Focusing on taking an exercise close to failure, even if you don't feel it activating, is the most important part. That will come with time and practice. You kind of developing your mind-muscle connection or feeling the muscle. As studies show that the more advanced lifters tend to have better mind-muscle connection. Lats and upper back and glutes are common muscle groups that people struggle to feel and connect to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not seeing benefits from loading those muscle groups in exercises like, again, a kickstand row for the lats or upper back, or a step up for the glutes. So why is this? And I was thinking about this, and this is just my own hypothesis. So this isn't necessarily based on science. This is something that we learned in PT school, and I don't have the data to back this up, but I do think this is interesting. It's about 2-point discrimination. So 2-point discrimination is a test which measures the smallest distance at which a person can distinguish 2 separate points of touch on their skin as distinct sensations rather than feeling it as a single point. So for example, you would take a tool like 2 pens or a caliper and touch the skin with 2 points. And the distance between those 2 points is adjusted, and the patient reports whether they're feeling those 2 points as either 2 distinct points or just 1 point. So they would touch the person with 2 or 1 points and say, okay, am I touching you with 2 points or am I touching you with 1 point? And what they found is that we have very good 2-point discrimination of our palms. You could close your eyes and you could tell for sure, okay, they're touching me with 2 points, they're touching me with 1 point. I can tell how close those 2 points are together. We have very poor 2-point discrimination of our backs. So you can try this with your friends, touch your friend's back with, 2 pens or something with a really fine point. and bring those points closer together. And oftentimes you cannot tell if you're getting touched by 2 pens or 1 pen because your 2-point discrimination of your back muscles just is not very good. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think that might translate into our ability to feel and sense our back muscles, like our lats and our traps, contracting and working during certain exercises. So I'll probably do a separate podcast about mind muscle connection, but I wanted to share that as a takeaway in this episode as well. So I hope this was interesting. Remember not to overthink these things. Just stay consistent and you will see results. We'll see you all next week. Same time, same place. Bye for now.